Good to see everybody this morning. Hope you had a good week. Open your Bibles to Ezekiel Chapter 19. Ezekiel Chapter 19 is where we're going to pick up this morning. We continue in our study of the book of Ezekiel. We're talking about just kind of a general review of where we are. We're in about 592, 590 BC, between the second and third captivity of Judah. Ezekiel had been taken captive in about 597. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed in 586, so you've got an 11-year period there. And this particular book was probably halfway between those. Ezekiel was one of the three major prophets at the same time. Ezekiel was by the river Kibar with the captives. Jeremiah was still in Jerusalem, and Daniel was in the palace with the king. And Ezekiel is, as both Jeremiah and Daniel, warning the people about the captivity that is coming and the fact that they have been sinful and wicked, and because of that they're about to get punished by God. Chapter 19 is, he refers to it as a lamentation, and take up a lamentation for the princes of Israel. A lamentation is a mournful song, oftentimes connected to funerals. It has to do with a sad occasion, with something that that's not great or outstanding. And so we pick up here in this chapter, the children of Israel, the kings of Judah, had been provided every opportunity for them to be a productive people and a great nation, and under God's direction. Unfortunately, they did not follow what they should have followed. They had been given a great land. You remember when they first moved into it, it was talked about being a land that flowed with milk and honey. They had been given God's direction, had been given prophetic guidance, had been given the law, had been given God's protection for years. And they unfortunately did not take advantage of all of that until they ended up in the position that they were in. The problem that they had was God had made a promise through David that someone was going to sit on David's throne forever. God had promised them that he would protect the temple. And they had taken that promise and pulled it off out over here by itself, instead of leaving it in the context. The promises of God are almost always conditional. God did promise to protect the temple. God did promise to have a descendant of David on the throne, conditional upon their obedience, conditional upon their being his people. When they violated that contract, the contract is null and void. If you sign a contract to make 4 years worth of payments on a car, and you make a year and a half and you stop making payments, they're going to come get the car. You might look at them and say, well, what are you doing that for? We had a contract. Yeah, you broke the contract. When one person violates the contract is null and void. And so that's what happened with the children of Israel. He starts here. What was your mother? A lioness among lions she crouched. In the midst of young lions she reared her cubs. She brought up one of her cubs. He became a young lion, and he learned to catch prey. He devoured men. The nations heard about him. He was caught in their pit, and they brought him with hooks in the land of Egypt. As you move through this chapter, you're going to find we're going to be talking about three different kings of Judah. If you remember the tribe of Judah amongst the original 12 tribes, the symbol of the tribe of Judah was a lion. And so he's talking here about a lioness, that would be the tribe of Judah. And these whelps are these men who came out of Judah who became kings. And so notice he says he became a young lion, he learned to catch prey, devoured men. The nations heard about him, he was caught in their pit, and they brought him with hooks to the land of Egypt. If you go back to 2 Kings, you read about a king by the name of Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz reigned for 3 months in Jerusalem. He was taken captive by Pharaoh Necho to Egypt. So that's what you have reference to. You're talking about Jehoahaz being taken to Egypt. Verse 4, when she saw that she waited in vain, that her hope was lost, that this king is gone, this king's off into captivity, she took another of her cubs and made him a young lion. He prowled among the lions. He became a young lion. He learned how to catch prey. He devoured men. seized their widows. He laid waste their cities. The land was appalled, and all who were in it at the sound of his roaring. The nations set against him from provinces on every side. They spread their net over him. He was taken in their pit. With hooks they put him in a cage. They brought him to the king of Babylon. They brought him into custody, that his voice should no more be heard on the mountains of Israel. And so when Jehoahaz was taken king, or was taken captive and sent to Egypt, then along comes Jehoiachin. And it talks here, notice it talks here about he devoured men, he seized their widows, he laid waste their cities, the land was appalled. Jehoiachin was not a very good king in a couple of different ways. One of them was he was unfaithful to God. He was an idol worshiper. He was immoral. He was wicked. The second thing was he mistreated his own people. He took advantage of them in order to support his own lifestyle. He's the king. He's supposed to be living in lavish style. He's supposed to have all this fancy food and all these wonderful clothes and this great house and all these things. All these great servants he's supposed to have. And although he can have that, somebody's going to pay for it. Who's going to pay for it? The people of Israel, the people of Judah are. And so even though they are in bad straits because at this point of their relationship with Babylon and they're being oppressed, Jehoiachin doesn't care. He's going to take advantage of Judah. He's going to make them suffer while he lives in a lap of luxury. One individual pointed out, and I didn't research any further, but one individual pointed out that during his reign, he undertook a lot of fancy building projects where he was building fancy buildings and wasting a lot of money on things that weren't really needed in order to enhance his own reputation. But then notice it goes on to say, they brought him into custody. They brought him to the king of Babylon. In 597, when Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem for the second time, Jehoiachin was king. And Jehoiachin was carried captive by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon, where he stayed until he died. And so you've got one king going to Egypt, you've got the second king going to Babylon. And then he says in verse 10, he changes his symbol. He goes from a lioness and a whip to a vine and branches. He says, your mother was like a vine in a vineyard, planted by the water, fruitful and full of branches, by reason of abundant water. Its strong stems became ruler scepters. It towered aloft among the thick boughs. It was seen in the height of the mass of its branches. What do you think? Talking about, if you're talking about Judah here, and he's talking here about it being fruitful and planted by the water, being full of branches by reason of abundant water, strong stems became ruler scepters. Who do you think he's talking about there? What was the height of Judah's glory? David and Solomon. So he's backing up here a little bit. He says, this is what you could have been. During the reigns of David and Solomon, they were that. They were one of the most renowned nations in that part of the world. People came from all over the world to simply talk to Solomon because he was so wise. He had millions and millions and millions of dollars. One of the passages mentioned he got 616 talents of gold a year. A talent of gold is about $26,000. So you multiply 616 times 26,000. And I can't do that at the top of my head, but that's how much. That doesn't count the silver and the brass and all the other. That's just the gold. God greatly blessed David and Solomon, but they didn't remain faithful. He says in verse 12, the vine was plucked up in fury and cast down to the ground. What happens to a vine when you rip it out of the ground? It dies. The roots that go into the ground are what supplies it with the nutrients that it needs. You pull up the roots, and it's dead. It dries up. The east wind dried up its fruit. They were stripped and weathered, and for a strong stem, fire consumed it. Now it is planted in the wilderness in a dry and thirsty land, and fire had gone out. from the stem of its shoots, has consumed its fruit, so there remains in it no strong stem, no scepter for ruling. This is a lamentation and has become a lamentation. Okay, it says, the vine was plucked up in fury and cast down to the ground. If the vine is Judah, when was the vine ripped up out of the ground? Babylonian captivity. The nation died. It was moved from Judah, and the nation ended up being no more. The vine was plucked up in fury, cast down to the ground. The east wind dried up its fruits. They were stripped off and withered. What good is a grapevine if it doesn't have any grapes? The only thing you do is burn it. Not only, he says, it's been ripped up out of the ground, but its fruit has died. They were stripped up and withered. As for its strong stem, fire consumed it. The strong stem there is in all likelihood a reference to the monarchy. That's the strong part of Judah. That's where the power was located. That's what he says. The strong stem, fire consumed it. That means the monarchy's gone. The leadership is gone. The kings are gone. There's nothing there anymore. Now it is planted in the wilderness in a dry and thirsty land. Okay, if this vine is Judah, and it's been ripped up, and now it's planted in the wilderness, where is it? Where is Judah? In Babylon. It's not where it's supposed to be. It's not, and it's home. It's been taken somewhere else. It's not, this vine, this thing that represents the nation of Israel, is now been moved. It's in a dry and thirsty land. It's dry and thirsty, not necessarily physically, but I think probably spiritually. Because there is no, in Babylon, there is no, except for the Jews who would do it, there is no worship of God. There is no temple. There is no devotion to Jehovah. There is no devotion to righteousness. There is no devotion to right and wrong. And so they're in a dry and thirsty land, a land that doesn't worship and approve of and accept God. Its fruit has been consumed. There remains in it no strong stem, no scepter for ruling.
So is Zedekiah, is he going to represent the strong branch?
The strong branch is in this context a representation of the monarchy, the kings, because that's what held the nation together. Without leadership, whatever kind of leadership it is, whether it's a monarchy or a president or a dictator, without leadership, nations don't survive. Without some form of strong leadership, whatever that leadership is, whatever form it takes, if you look at a monarchy, when they've got a weak king, they're not doing very well. When you look at a dictatorship, if you've got a man who's not doing what he ought to be doing, that nation doesn't do very well. It takes leadership. We talked about this some on Sunday night. It takes a leadership to accomplish things, and when you don't have it, you don't get much done. And now Judah as a nation is in Babylon. The people are in Babylonian captivity. The nation itself really doesn't exist. And he says there is no strong stem, no scepter for ruling. There's no king. There's no leader. And the fact of the matter is, the nation of Judah never again had its own king. When they returned from Babylonian captivity, they were under Medo-Persian rule, then they were under Greek rule, and then they got a little bit of independence, but there wasn't really a king. There were a couple of, the Maccabees led them for a while, and then they fell under Roman authority. They never again had their own national Jewish king. And it all comes down to the fact that they made the choice to forsake God. because of their wickedness, because of their immorality, because of their idolatry, because of their refusal to submit to the law of God, God punished them. You have to understand, we need to remember, our service to God is voluntary. We get to choose whether or not we want to obey God or not. But there are consequences to making that choice. Either way you go. If you choose God, there are consequences to that. If you choose not God, there are consequences to that. And so God has made us free moral agents. God has given us the ability to choose. But with that choice, there are consequences. And a holy, righteous God cannot tolerate wickedness and immorality and unholiness. It's a violation of his nature. And one of the big issues going on in the religious world today with this push for tolerance and tolerance and tolerance is, at the foundation of that is a misunderstanding of the nature of Jehovah. Because the idea that God loves so much that he will just accept anything is a contradiction of who he is. He can't tolerate sin. He can't, because of who he is, because of his nature. Just like if I go ahead, if I were to get a ladder and climb up top of this building and jump, what's going to happen? You mean I can't fly? It's a violation of who I am. I can't fly. If I get an airplane, that's a different issue. But I personally can't fly because of the being that I am. God cannot tolerate sin because of the being that he is. He is a holy God. And as a holy God, sin and immorality is an abomination to him. The word used throughout the Old Testament, the word is translated abomination. Hebrew language originally translated means makes you sick to your stomach. Now, I know God probably doesn't have a stomach, and that's not literal, but it gives you the idea. Something he just cannot tolerate, he cannot put up with because of the nature of who he is. Does anyone have a question or comment? Anything we've talked about up to this point? Now, I will mention there are some people who believe that chapter 19 was written after 587 because of its reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. But there are all kinds of prophecies in the Old Testament about the destruction of Jerusalem, so I have a problem with that being a prophecy either. So,
what gets me is a lot of people transpose the glory of Israel to the state of Israel now, and that we have to support it because they are God's chosen people. Well, the thing is, and I don't mean to be anti-Semitic, they gave that up. They gave that up of being God's chosen people, by their disobedience.
well, I've mentioned this on a couple of occasions. If you want to, and I happen to, if you want to support Israel as a state, politically, that is certainly your right. Try to say that is an indication of your relationship to God. It's falsehood. The Bible tells us in the book of Romans and the book of Galatians as well, that Jews, the word Jew in the sense of being God's people, they are Christians, not national Jews. And God doesn't have any special connection with the physical land of Israel anymore, or the physical city of Jerusalem anymore. Part of the issue, we talked about this some, I think, last week, part of the issue is you've got all these people sitting around waiting for 1,000-year reign. They're waiting for Jesus to come back and actually reign in Jerusalem. In order for him to reign in Jerusalem, God's got to have a country there. And so a lot of that connection to Israel is connected to that 1,000-year reign. And I saw thing yesterday on, I think it was on the internet, where a very popular sports figure was talking about the fact that we were headed toward a cashless society, and the Bible had predicted that, and we were getting really close to the rapture. No one problem with that. The Bible doesn't say anything about a rapture. But it's very easy when you move away from the truth in one area, it leads you to move away from the truth in other areas as well, because they're all connected.
Well, I think that part of it, this support of it, is a feeling of, we did them wrong. We could have stopped. It's guilt.
That may very well be, I don't know. There's a lot of that. As far as I am concerned, and you have a right to disagree with me if you want to, but this is my position. The existence of Israel today is a political question, not a religious one. It's nothing to do with our relationship with God. Nothing. Anyone else? Yeah, that's true. God's original plan was there would not be a king. The children of Israel got a king because they asked for one. And God gave them what they wanted, which is another, I think, interesting point. Most of the time, God gives people what they want. May not be what they need. They didn't need a king. That's what they wanted. That's what God gave them. And look at what happened. You have to be careful about what you ask for. You might get it.
I have a question. You know, in the Old Testament, it says people offend themselves, devil have peace. There will never be peace. But that's because they wanted the king and did so many other things that they're just not going to be in the end. But I don't know about Jerusalem, but in the end, didn't so I mean, in the beginning, they'll never get along. They'll always be discontent.
Well, they should have been, if they'd remained faithful to God, they would have been God's people throughout. They would have continued to be in Jerusalem. The temple would still be there. They would still have a king, and they would still be the nation of Israel. The issue with that is, and we sometimes, I think, misapply or misunderstand the difference between the foreknowledge of God and predestination. God knew Israel was going to leave him. God knew they were going to be unfaithful. And you can see that throughout the prophecies, throughout the things he talks about. God did not force that. God did not predestinate that. There's a difference in knowing something's going to happen and making it happen. And a lot of people in the world today get confused. We start talking about God's foreknowledge, God's prophetical knowledge, and predestination. To predestinate something is to make it happen. The cross was predestinated. Your salvation is not. That goes against, if you think about it for a moment, that goes against the very fiber of the gospel. If I have no choice, and I'm going to heaven because God said I'm going to heaven, then what's all this for? I go out in the world and live like I want to because God says I'm going to heaven. And not really connected, but this is kind of interesting to me. These people who believe, you're either predestined to go to heaven or you're predestined to go to hell and you've got no choice with it. I've never met a single one of those who thought they were predestined to go to hell. Everybody I've ever met who believes in predestination believes they're going to heaven. Whether that means anything or not. Question or comment from anyone else? I'm done. Huh?